Okay, so now we begin to put it all together. We're figuring out how to explain the fluctuations, and we're also figuring out how to stabilize from future large fluctuations. So in this module, we do an overview of aggregate supply and aggregate demand, fiscal policy, and monetary policy. So again, I've organized into a series of questions, answers, and tools in this brief overview of everything that can be covered in this section. So the question, how can we explain and predict economic fluctuations? So the question, how can we explain and predict economic fluctuations? So of course we want to prevent future depressions. We know and expect and admit that free market economies are volatile. So our answer is, well, let's look at our key economic model for macroeconomics. That's the aggregate supply and demand model. It can handle these questions and more. And unlike the previous models that we've worked on, income expenditure models, we are allowing everything to vary, including the price level. So this is your general aggregate supply and demand model. We notice with the long run aggregate supply at potential output, upward sloping short run aggregate supply because of sticky wages, downward sloping aggregate demand curve, wealth effect, interest rate effect, net export effect, all explain the downward slope. And we can use these to understand fluctuations. So the things that shift the aggregate supply curve, mostly cost of production, productivity, technology issues, and the things that shift aggregate demand, including wealth and expectations, and things that affect consumer spending at every price level, consumer and business spending, rather, at every price level. We can begin to model what it looks like if there's a shift, right? So like if you've got an increase in aggregate demand, what that looks like, or an increase in aggregate supply, or a decrease in aggregate demand, or a decrease in aggregate supply. So you can model those, and of course, there's the short-run movement, and then, if you want to get fancy, the theoretical long-run self-correction mechanism, we work through that as well. And the follow-up question is, how can we prevent large fluctuations, right? So how can we use our knowledge of what moves the economy around to solve the problem of volatile nature of the free market economy? So how do we stabilize? Well, we know aggregate demand is volatile, especially investment spending, business investment spending, and that overall spending can be affected by policymakers. So the government can directly affect spending because it is part of total spending, right? We've got consumer investment or business spending, government spending, and net exports or the rest of the world spending. So fiscal policy is just the changing of aggregate demand through changes in government purchases or taxes or transfers. So either directly affecting government purchases or indirectly affecting consumer spending through how much taxes are charged or how many government transfers like unemployment, welfare payments, Social Security payments, etc., that do affect people's spending. Why? Because we want to move the economy back to potential output. If the economy's spending has fallen, we want to pick it back up by increasing consumer spending or government spending through the tools that the government has. Expansionary fiscal policy is the direction where you want to increase or expand aggregate demand by either increasing government spending, increasing the transfer payments, or cutting taxes. It's appropriate during a recessionary gap or a recession. Contractionary fiscal policy is appropriate during an inflationary gap when the economy is running too hot. It's to the right of our potential output temporarily, and inflation really begins to heat up because there's so much spending. So we cut government spending, cut transfer payments, or increase taxes, all in the attempt to reduce aggregate demand. So you'll notice all fiscal policy works only through, let me pick the right pen here, on aggregate demand, right? So there is no in fiscal policy, we imagine that it does not work through the aggregate supply curve, but it works through the aggregate demand curve because it's working through spending, which is good because spending is the more volatile of the two curves anyway. All right, and then the next question would be, how much do we do, right? So we know that we can manipulate the aggregate demand curve. How much should we do? If we notice that there's a recessionary gap of 100 billion, how much money should we increase government spending by? So knowing that each dollar gets spent multiple times, an injection of spending of a certain amount will have a much larger impact, so we need to use our multipliers. The tools here were the government spending multiplier and the tax and transfer multiplier. And finally, fiscal policy is not all there is to help stabilize aggregate demand, right? Business spending especially is affected by interest rate, as so is consumer spending, but business spending even more affected by interest rate. So more expensive interest rates mean more expensive loans, so less loans will get taken out. So businesses will spend less when interest rates are higher. So looking ahead, we can imagine that if there's a way to change interest rates, we could change aggregate demand. And sure enough, the other branch of macroeconomic stabilization policy is monetary policy. So there's fiscal and monetary policy. The federal government does fiscal policy. The Federal Reserve, our central bank, does monetary policy. And the tools that it has, it's got 3 different tools. We, as of yet, have only defined open market operations, which is where they get money in or out by buying or selling bonds to get money supply changed so that interest rates are changed. Again, it doesn't matter how the money gets into the economy. The Federal Reserve simply injects money in, and it gets into banks, and then banks go through the money creation process through the fractional reserve system. Remember, they're only required to hold back about 10% of deposits on reserve, and so the money multiplier goes into effect, very much like the spending multiplier. An injection of $100 is going to end up being something like $1,000 when you multiply it by the money multiplier, which is 1 over the reserve ratio, in this case 10%. So the Federal Reserve uses that when it's designing its monetary policy. But fiscal and monetary policy both end up affecting aggregate demand and are an attempt to stabilize aggregate demand from the volatility that we know is endemic to the free market system. There's your overview.